Viewer discretion is advised. This story isn't just disturbing, it's heartbreaking. It's the kind of tragedy that makes even hardened police officers break down in tears. In that Jacksonville courtroom, every person wept. The judge, the reporters, the jurors, and yes, the officers themselves. Because behind every word spoken that day was the echo of a little girl's laughter, silenced forever in the most unthinkable way. But the story didn't begin in a courtroom filled with grief. It began on a quiet street lined with tidy lawns and white fences, the kind of place where nothing bad was supposed to happen. Neighbors left their doors unlocked. Children played freely until dusk. It was the kind of community that believed evil was something that lived far away, on the news, in another city, never next door. That illusion shattered one ordinary Tuesday evening. An 8-year-old girl named Maddie Clifton vanished from her own front yard without a sound. One moment she was playing in the sun, the next she was gone. The neighborhood was thrown into chaos. Police sirens replaced the songs of cicadas, and worried parents called their children indoors. Everyone feared a stranger had taken her, but they were wrong. For nearly a week, search parties filled the streets. Volunteers handed out flyers, prayed, and refused to give up hope. The killer was among them, helping, smiling, pretending to care. No one suspected him. How could they? He was a boy, barely 14, living just across the street. When the truth finally came to light, it broke everyone. Not just because of what he did, but because of how close he had been all along. This is the story of Maddie Clifton, a story that forces us to look at the most uncomfortable truth of all. Sometimes, the greatest danger doesn't come from strangers in the dark. It comes from those we trust. To understand what was lost, you first have to see where it all began. Jacksonville, Florida, a city vast enough to feel like its own country. A place where the St. Johns River defies the rules by flowing north, carving a silver line through neighborhoods that seem untouched by time. The roar of naval jets often echoes above the rooftops, mixing with the distant hum of cicadas. It's a city proud of its southern charm, its football chants, and its easy pace of life. But this story didn't unfold downtown among the lights or along the crowded docks. It happened in Lakewood, a quiet suburb that looked like something from a postcard of the 1950s. Picture neat brick houses, trimmed hedges, and mailboxes with hand-painted names. Here, people still waved at each other from porches. Kids rode their bikes until sunset, and mothers didn't worry when their children ran off to play. It was a cocoon of safety, or so they thought. In one of those homes lived the Clifton family, Steve, Sheila, and their 2 daughters, Jessie and Maddie. Maddie, born on June 17, 1990, was the heart of that house. Everyone who met her remembered her eyes first, big, brown, and filled with life. She had the energy of a spark and the smile of a child who believed the world was good. Maddie and Jessie were as close as sisters could be. Jessie, older by 3 years, was shy, bookish, and gentle. Maddie was the opposite, a tomboy who loved sports, dirt, and laughter. Together, they were unstoppable, 2 halves of one childhood rhythm. Their parents adored them. Steve worked long hours at a fabrication shop. Sheila kept the home warm and welcoming. Theirs was a family stitched together by love and routine. Piano lessons, dinners at 6, bedtime stories, and whispered giggles between the girls' rooms at night. No one could have imagined how quickly that peace would vanish. In a neighborhood built on trust, danger was the last thing anyone saw coming, and when it arrived, it came quietly, in the fading light of an ordinary November afternoon. It was November 3rd, 1998, a Tuesday like any other in Lakewood. The sun hung low over the quiet streets, throwing long, golden shadows across driveways and front lawns. Election day. Parents came home late from work, neighbors waved from their porches, and children filled the evening air with laughter. For 8-year-old Maddie Clifton, it was a day meant for playing, not for fear. She had just come home from her Catholic school, still wearing her red t-shirt and shorts. After a quick snack and a few minutes at the piano, she rushed outside, eager to enjoy the fading daylight. Across the street, her neighbor, an older boy named Josh, was somewhere nearby. And in another yard, a family friend, Larry, was hitting golf balls. Maddie joined him, giggling as the ball bounced across the grass. When they ran out of balls, Maddie cheerfully said she'd run home to get more. Larry watched her skip down the street. That was the last time anyone saw her alive. As the sky dimmed, the usual calm of Lakewood wrapped the neighborhood. Dinner smells drifted through open windows. Televisions flickered behind curtains. Around 6 o'clock, Maddie's mother, Sheila, stepped onto the porch and called her daughters in for dinner. Jessie came running. Maddie didn't. Sheila called again, louder this time. Silence. Jessie hadn't seen her sister since the afternoon. At first there was no panic, just confusion. Sheila walked down the street, knocking on doors, asking every neighbor the same question. Each, "No, we haven't seen her," made her heart beat faster. Within minutes, what had been a peaceful evening turned into a desperate search. Neighbors left their homes, flashlights cutting through the dark. Jessie jumped on her bike, pedaling down every alley, shouting her sister's name into the cold November air. As the minutes passed, fear crept in. The kind of fear that claws its way into a mother's chest when instinct whispers that something is terribly wrong. At 6:33 p.m., Sheila dialed 911. Her voice trembled as she said the words no parent ever wants to say. "My daughter's missing." By nightfall, the Lakewood community had come alive in a way it never had before. Hundreds of people searching, praying, hoping. They didn't yet know that the person responsible was standing among them, pretending to help. By dawn, Lakewood no longer looked like the safe suburban dream it once was. Police cruisers lined the streets, yellow tape fluttered in the early light, and volunteers carried stacks of freshly printed flyers bearing Maddie's smiling face. Helicopters circled overhead while dogs searched yards, drains, and wooded areas nearby. Everyone clung to hope that she'd just wandered off and would soon come running home. But as hours turned into days, that hope began to fray. Investigators had nothing. No witnesses, no clues, no signs of struggle. The last person to see Maddie alive was her older neighbor, Larry Gisham, the man who had played golf with her that afternoon. It was only natural that suspicion turned toward him. Larry was questioned again and again. He didn't deny anything. Yes, he'd played with Maddie, he said, but when they ran out of golf balls, she said she'd go home and never came back. Detectives dug deeper and discovered that Larry had a criminal record: drunk driving, car theft, even an old sexual assault charge that had been dropped years earlier. It was enough to make him look guilty, and in the eyes of the public, he was. They put him through a polygraph test, and he failed. For many, that was all the proof they needed, but Larry kept insisting he was innocent. He even volunteered a DNA sample to clear his name. Investigators were torn. Would a guilty man offer that? Maybe, maybe not. Still, without a body or physical evidence, there was nothing to compare his DNA to. So, they searched again. And again. Police scoured every inch of Lakewood: backyards, garages, attics, sewers. The National Guard joined in, crawling through drainage tunnels. Flyers went out across Florida, even appearing at football games and gas stations. It became one of the largest searches the city had ever seen. Everywhere you looked, people wore yellow ribbons for Maddie, but behind every prayer, every candle, there was a growing sense of dread. Days passed, the phone never rang, and inside the Clifton home, the silence grew heavier. Sheila barely slept. Steve blamed himself. Jessie was terrified to step outside. The perfect neighborhood had turned into a place of shadows and suspicion, and still no one imagined that the truth was hiding less than 50 feet away, in a room just across the street. It was November 10th, exactly 1 week since Maddie had vanished. By then, Lakewood was exhausted. Neighbors still searching but with hollow eyes, the Cliftons praying without answers. That morning, one of their neighbors, a woman named Missy Phillips, noticed something strange in her son's room. Her son was 14-year-old Joshua, a quiet boy who lived directly across from the Clifton family. Missy had gone in to clean, frustrated as usual by the mess of a teenage boy. But this time, something caught her attention. A large wet patch near the corner of his waterbed, and a smell she couldn't quite place. At first she thought the mattress was leaking. She touched it, damp. Then she noticed strips of duct tape holding the bed frame together. That was odd. The longer she looked, the more uneasy she felt. Determined to fix the leak, Missy lifted the mattress. Beneath the wooden frame, she saw a small white sock. When she tried to pull it free, it wouldn't move, and then her hand brushed against something cold. She froze. Shining a flashlight into the dark space beneath the bed, she saw what no mother should ever see. a tiny, motionless foot wearing that white sock. Missy screamed and ran outside, flagging down a police officer who had been stationed nearby. Within minutes, her house was swarming with detectives. They lifted the bed and found Maddie's body hidden underneath, curled into a fetal position, her little hand still gripping one of the metal brackets as if she'd tried to push her way out. The room reeked of air fresheners, incense, and disinfectant. On the ceiling fan, high above reach, they found faint traces of blood. Inside a drawer, a small utility knife. In another, a missing person flyer with Maddie's picture, folded neatly beside a photograph of her older sister Jessie. Detectives couldn't believe it. They had been in that very room before, days earlier, interviewing Josh while sitting on the very bed that concealed the missing girl. They remembered the faint odor and how Missy had casually explained, "It's probably the parrots." Nobody had thought twice. Now, standing in that same room, the truth hit like a tidal wave. Maddie had never left the neighborhood. She had been there all along, beneath the bed of a boy who'd smiled, searched, and pretended to care. Joshua Phillips was at school when police made the discovery. He had no idea that, just blocks away, his home had turned into a crime scene swarmed by detectives. Officers entered his classroom quietly, called his name, and walked him out in handcuffs. The students watched in stunned silence. The boy who had joined search parties, handed out flyers, and cried for Maddie was now under arrest. At the station, Josh's father confronted him first. "Your mother found Maddie under your bed," he said, his voice breaking. "What did you do?" Josh didn't deny it. Within minutes, he began to talk. His story was that it was an accident. He claimed he and Maddie had been playing baseball in his yard when the ball hit her in the eye. She started crying, and terrified his father would be angry, he panicked. He said he dragged her inside, covered her mouth to stop her screams, and when she wouldn't quiet down, he struck her with a bat. Then, realizing she was bleeding, he grabbed a knife, insisting he didn't know what else to do. He said he hid her under the bed, thinking she was dead, and when he heard her still breathing later that night, he finished it. But the evidence didn't fit his story. There were no bruises on Maddie's face, no sign of a baseball injury. There were, however, multiple stab wounds and no proof that the attack had been sudden or impulsive. Even worse, detectives discovered Josh had been watching adult films before and after the murder, casting a darker shadow over his so-called panic. The trial took place the following summer. Josh, just 15 by then, sat quietly in the courtroom, never once meeting the Clifton family's eyes. The prosecution laid everything bare: the knife, the bed, the blood, the evidence of concealment. They even brought a section of his bed into court to show how Maddie's body had been wedged beneath it. When the photos of the crime scene were displayed, people gasped, others turned away in tears. Even the officers who had worked the case wept. Josh's defense argued that he was just a frightened boy with brain abnormalities, incapable of rational thought under pressure. They begged the court to treat him as a juvenile, but the jury needed only 2 hours. They found him guilty of first-degree murder. When the verdict was read, Josh didn't flinch. No tears, no reaction. Maddie's parents, however, broke down completely. Their daughter's killer had been the boy from across the street, the one they'd trusted. Joshua Phillips was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. And as he was led away, one chapter of the nightmare ended, but another was just beginning for the families left behind. After the verdict, silence fell over Lakewood. The reporters left, the police tape came down, and life was supposed to move on. But it never truly did. The Clifton home became a place of grief frozen in time. Maddie's bedroom stayed exactly as she left it, her piano untouched, her favorite red t-shirt folded neatly in a drawer. For Sheila and Steve Clifton, each morning began with the same unbearable question. How do you keep living when your child is gone? Jessie, Maddie's older sister, was just 11 when her world collapsed. Overnight, she went from an ordinary girl to the sister of the victim, a title that followed her everywhere. Kids at school didn't know how to talk to her. Some were kind, others curious in cruel ways. In later interviews, Jessie admitted she remembered almost nothing from that time, as if her mind had shut down to protect her from the pain. I tried to be strong, she said, because I knew if I broke, my parents would too. Across the street, another home was falling apart in a different way. Missy Phillips, the woman who had discovered Maddie's body, had also lost her son that day. She had done the right thing, but it came at an unbearable cost. The community blamed her, though she was innocent. She barely left her house. She spoke softly, moved slowly, and carried the look of someone who had seen too much. And then, something extraordinary happened. Jessie, the girl whose sister had been taken, began visiting Missy. She helped her carry groceries, walked her dog, and sometimes just sat beside her in silence. No words, no judgment, only compassion. Maddie's mother, Sheila, soon joined her. Two women bound by the same tragedy, one who lost a daughter, one who lost a son, began to heal together. It wasn't forgiveness, it was something deeper, an understanding that both families had been destroyed by the same act of evil. For a time, they became each other's support, proof that even in the darkest places, humanity can still exist. But the wounds never truly closed. Eventually, Sheila and Steve moved away from the house, where every wall carried an echo of Maddie's laughter. Years later, they divorced, their marriage unable to survive the weight of what had been taken from them. Still, the small acts of grace between the families remained a quiet legacy, a reminder that love, in its purest form, is sometimes simply the refusal to hate. Joshua Phillips entered prison at 15 and never came out again. He grew up behind concrete walls, surrounded by men who had lived most of their lives in darkness. For years, he stayed quiet, kept to himself, and followed every rule. By all accounts, he became a model inmate. He earned his high school diploma, took every class offered to him, and told interviewers that prison had made him mature. But for the Clifton family, those words meant nothing. No amount of good behavior could bring Maddie back. In 2008, a decade after the murder, Josh gave his first interview from prison. His voice was calm, almost reflective, as he spoke about life behind bars, about time, and about how he had learned empathy. When asked about Maddie, his answers were short, distant. He said he thought about her all the time, yet every sentence somehow returned to himself, his growth, his suffering, his regrets. For many, it sounded less like remorse and more like self-pity. Then, in 2017, nearly 20 years after the crime, Josh was back in court. Florida had changed its laws for juvenile offenders, recognizing that teenage brains aren't fully developed. His life sentence was reconsidered. For the Clifton family, it was like ripping open an old wound. They had to sit once more in a courtroom, listening to the same horrific details, the same evidence, the same memories. When Josh took the stand, he read a long apology. He said he was sorry, that he prayed every day for the Cliftons, that he had found faith, that he had learned the value of life. His voice trembled, but the pain in the courtroom wasn't his. It belonged to Maddie's parents, who had to hear their daughter's name spoken by the boy who ended her life. When Sheila was asked how she felt, she said quietly, "He can talk about peace all he wants. My daughter never got that chance." The judge upheld the original sentence, life in prison without parole. Josh's next review will come after 25 years, a possibility, but not a promise. Today, the house on Fleetwood Road still stands, though the neighborhood has changed. For those who remember, the story of Maddie Clifton is not just a crime, it's a warning. Evil doesn't always look like a stranger. Sometimes it hides behind the smile of someone you think you know. Maddie would be in her 30s now, maybe a mother, maybe a teacher, maybe still living in Jacksonville with her own family. But instead, her memory lives on in the hearts of those who refuse to forget her. A reminder of innocence lost, of love shattered, and of the haunting question that still lingers. Why? And perhaps that's what hurts the most. Not just that a life was taken, but that no one will ever truly understand why it had to be.